All right. I'm getting a few more stragglers coming in here. Thanks for joining me at the first Knowledge Nook session of the morning. Here we are, kind of winding down at World Dairy Expo. It's definitely awesome to be here. These Knowledge Nook sessions are a wonderful opportunity to definitely share different ideas and perspectives, and I'm certainly glad that you guys are here with me in this room today. So today I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the perspectives that we have on rumen health. But before I really dive too far in, I wanted to talk about smaXtec as a whole and our company. Some of you may not be entirely familiar with us, and we are a health monitoring company and system. And so not only are we national, but we are also international as well. So our headquarters is in Graz, Austria, and our US headquarters is in Madison, Wisconsin. And so it's great to be here 4 years later after we launched at World Dairy Expo in 2021, so that's certainly a pretty cool thing to be on this stage today. So like I mentioned, we're in 26 countries and we are expanding pretty rapidly. Now, before I get too far into my talk today, I did want to highlight this particular quote from somebody that is near and dear to my heart, Professor Emeritus Tom Jenkins. He was one of my major advisors at Clemson University during my grad stay. So he had said, if the mammary gland is the engine driving the synthesis of milk and milk fat, I see the rumen as the gas pedal and the brake. And I think that that's certainly a profound statement, because we know that depending on what kind of substrates we provide in the rumen and what those microbial species are able to do with that substrate to provide the mammary gland with the needed materials to make a lot of milk and quality milk. And so that's really the whole central feature here, is the rumen is the most important part of the animal. And so we like to talk about different levels of production and why we get those different levels. If we think about a tale of two cows, let's say we have two particular animals that may be very similar genetics, same dry matter intakes as a whole, maybe even the same pen. But ultimately, whenever we end up looking at what these animals are producing, let's say one is producing 100 pounds of milk and the other one maybe 80, maybe even less, and then even less components. But the genetic makeup is very, very similar between the two. And so we have to ask ourselves why that may be. And what it really comes down to is there's an underlying principle of the rumen efficiency and what the rumen is providing for the animal to be able to make that level of milk and component production. And so really it's not necessarily a tale of two cows, it's a tale of two rumens that really provide a lot of that performance that we're seeing and those performance differences. And so this one animal may have a really efficient rumen, things are clicking along, everything looks good, whereas the other animal may have, I would say, subpar rumen fermentation, maybe different signatures in her rumen pH that are causing some inefficiencies with feed conversion. And so this is really the central concept behind why we believe that rumen efficiency is incredibly important in looking into the rumen. So we have to start kind of having the discussion about why that may be. And of course, there is some intersection of the genetic makeup of these animals and what we see with the microbiome that we're selecting, and ultimately the rumen environments as well. And so whenever we look at how milk has increased over the last 60 to 70 years, obviously a big portion of that is due to genetic advancement. This talk is not going to be about genetics, but I do want to definitely mention that, because we've made huge leaps and bounds in the kind of animals that we're selecting for. Of course, the management perspective is also quite important. Those of you in this room that are nutritionists or have been around for some time, maybe even before TMRs were really a thing, whenever we had the TMR come onto the scene, that was a big deal, right? And so we've seen a lot of this advancement, and I think also with that, what we end up doing is we're selecting for some more efficient rumens as well. So we start to have some conversations about some of these traditional views of rumen health. And I often get in the conversation with consultants and nutritionists about, how are we monitoring that? What are we doing on the farm to actually measure rumen health? So
WWM, you need to move your car immediately.
So
or it will be
rumination.
towed.
Many of you that are using rumination as a metric for if a cow is okay or not, going to check on her. So rumination is an incredibly important tool and oftentimes kind of a proxy for identifying if rumen health is kind of in the area that we would like to see it. And so while we recognize that rumination is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle, it doesn't tell exactly the whole story. In our data, we have identified that we have some animals that have, seemingly satisfactory rumination. However, whenever we go in and we look at some of her pH data, we see a different story, especially related to feed intake as well. The other thing, too, that we also identify is that sometimes we just have the blanket Band-Aid of more length in the ration may fix it. And while physically effective fiber is incredibly important for rumen health, we can't just apply it as a blanket approach to be able to fix a situation that maybe feed management as a whole is not adequate or ration formulation is not setting the standard for that farm that we would like. Another thing that I always like to mention is feed the rumen first. I'm sure most of you in this room have heard that statement a lot. It's certainly something that we talk about a good amount, and I think that that's incredibly important to recognize that the rumen is really one of those central pieces that we need to consider whenever we're looking at overall production that we're trying to obtain for these animals. Last couple things here, the cow will buffer herself. And of course, a lot of that is true in a sense where we have the ability to have these compensatory mechanisms for the animal to ensalivate her feed, provide some salivary buffering, and ultimately buffer the rumen up to a point. But there is a limit to that capacity as well. And lastly, we identify that the rumen is quite resilient. This is something that we have seen throughout the years, many years of research, that the rumen is an incredible organ, and it's really fascinating to see what happens whenever we give it different diets, and especially in the case of subacute ruminal acidosis and how those animals bounce back from that. So we believe that by having a view into the rumen with continuous pH measurement, it gives us a much better perspective on overall rumen health, so that it's not guesswork. We're seeing into the black box of the rumen. Traditionally, we would look at what happens on the front end and the back end, and we might not always know what goes on in between. And so being able to have a continuous pH measurement provides a little bit of that perspective. And much like you would have different octanes that you would fuel your car, same thing with the cow. Depending on what kind of substrate we give her and the ability to keep her running to the highest efficiency, we want to keep that rumen going so that we can continue to produce high quality milk and lots of it. So we get into the conversation of how do we control the rumen environment, and it's certainly a bit of an ebb and flow and a constant battle with a variety of different factors. Of course, this is not exhaustive at all, but we're trying to prevent situations of really rapid fermentation throughout the day or weeks that may lead into some negative consequences and outcomes like low rumen pH, especially sustained low rumen pH, leading to acidosis and ultimately lameness as well. And so we can do that in a variety of ways. We're looking at making sure that we're providing adequate ration formulations for these animals to prevent an acid load that's going to be excessive and lead to these negative outcomes. So in a day, typically we see a very consistent pattern with regards to rumen pH that really carries on throughout the week. And the whole goal is that this pattern is consistent and is not disrupted too much with feed changes or different ration formulation. And what we see, if you look at the y-axis, you've got your pH value. On the x-axis, you've got the hours of the day. And the highest point of the day for pH is typically right before that first feed drop. And from then, as the animal starts to consume her feed, ferment that feed, we get volatile fatty acid production, dropping that pH. There might be an additional feeding that leads to an additional drop. But as those volatile fatty acids are cleared from the rumen, pH kind of resumes that normal high point for the next day. And this diurnal pattern just continues. And so this is a consistent thing that we see with the use of our bolus. And so we often talk about pH dysregulation and what that means. And ultimately, there's really three categories. So subacute ruminal acidosis, and then alkalosis. And really the whole idea is that we're able to get the best of both worlds with obtaining adequate amylolytic or starch-degrading bacterial populations and fiber-degrading or fibrolytic bacterial populations. And those bacterial populations really end up operating at different pH levels. And so the whole goal is that we're able to get the best of both worlds there, without ultimately shifting into a situation where we've got sustained low pH and acidosis, or on the flip side, more of an alkalosis type of scenario. So whenever we talk about gut health as a whole, we usually talk about the rumen and the reduction in rumen pH. And so historically, we just think about pH, of course, but what does that mean and why do we really care? So this is a great project from 2011, and I think it's a really excellent one to remind people of. And what these authors did is they ended up giving a particular acidosis-inducing event and fed a lot of grain, and then ended up switching them onto a grass diet. And so they looked at the rumen epithelium, and what they ended up finding is that the cows that had these high grain treatments and acidosis conditions definitely had rumen papillae that were impacted negatively. So if we look at the high forage treatment over here on the left versus the high grain, you can tell there's definitely a difference in terms of overall structural integrity. So that papillae is certainly impacted whenever we look at this cross-section. So this has the potential to result in poor performance, poor clearance of VFA, and an exacerbation of the problem. Additionally, whenever we look at the surface of the papillae, we can still see kind of a similar type of story. And so we can see on the left side with the high forage treatments, much smoother type of surface area. On the right are high grain or acidosis type of event, leading to certainly a much more jagged landscape. And so this can also result in the deterioration of these junctions between cells and ultimately result in microbial infiltration into the blood, which is something that we don't want, of course. So we've seen what happens to the rumen layer. But how can that impact digestive efficiency? That is the question. And so we know that sustained reductions in pH can ultimately lead to a variety of issues. And of course, some of you are quite familiar, I'm sure, with the fact how fiber digestibility can be negatively impacted. And so I wanted to just emphasize here the impact on fiber digestibility. This is a study that was done in the early 2000s, and it's still a really great one to reference in the fact that it really holds true still for what we see in a practical setting. And so the researchers induced acidosis by substituting about 25% of the TMR with a grain pellet. And afterwards, they conducted in situ digestibility measures. And ultimately what they ended up finding is that the cows that had acidosis and a reduced rumen pH, NDF digestibility dropped to about 37%. And so that's really quite a dramatic reduction of over 12%. And if we look at an animal that's eating, let's say, 50, 55, 60 pounds of dry matter intake, that's a lot of food that is not able to be utilized, which is quite a shame. And so lots of energy not able to be harvested appropriately. Additionally, there's alterations in the rumen microbiome that that are proliferated with this situation. And what we also see is an increase in inflammatory compounds like lipopolysaccharides or histamines. And so this becomes incredibly problematic in the fact that, we're inducing kind of a whole body inflammatory event in these negative situations with really low rumen pH. And ultimately, we want to be able to reduce these scenarios whenever we encounter, suboptimal rumen pH, a disruption in normal diurnal pH patterns, and we just want to have a healthy rumen that's able to ferment carbohydrates and fiber very efficiently. So whenever we're looking at rumen health as a whole, we have to be careful to not get siloed into looking at certain pH parameters. We can't just take one and run with it per se. So for example, if we look at time below a certain pH threshold, it's a commonly identified metric for pinpointing cases of subacute ruminal acidosis, of course. However, what is that time frame and how long should the animal stay there? That is the question, especially depending on where that is measured in the rumen, where those measurements are taken. And so additionally, we have situations where maybe you want to do ruminocentesis or collect rumen fluid via an oral tube. But how well have you truly captured the full picture of what is going on with rumen health? So these are all really important considerations whenever we're looking at evaluating rumen health as a whole. And we got to be careful about not singling out any of these particular parameters that may not represent the entire picture. So here is an example of why that is important. So we discussed low rumen pH and its impact on digestibility, but it's not always as simple as that. Remember, I just discussed how we can't silo one parameter. And so here we are again with an early 2000s study, and I think it's still quite relevant in all honesty. And so this was done in continuous culture fermenters, but the authors wanted to identify if digestibility was improved in low pH when variation was minimized. So they had 4 treatments with either pH allowed to exhibit normal diurnal variation or held at a constant pH of either 5.6 or 6.1. And so what they found, which I find incredibly interesting, is that there was little to no difference in the digestibility of dry matter or NDF digestibility when pH was varied at a 6.1 level, varied or constant at a 6.1 level. However, whenever we look at when the pH was low and varied, that had markedly reduced digestibilities. So this provides, of course, some evidence that it's not always cut and dry, and the pH level and variation can play a major role throughout the day in the animal and her overall efficiency. So how do some of these factors impact production? We can extrapolate what that means whenever digestibility is reduced and how much milk loss that may be. But what about the variation in a more practical type of setting? And there is certainly some evidence of how an animal is impacted in real time, but I think that this is an interesting example from 2010 where they had 8 ruminally cannulated cows that had indwelling pH probes that recorded every 10 minutes. And they followed these animals for 3 days after they had a grain challenge, and the pH values over the course of 3 days are displayed here. And so here are the results of the study with production, components, and pH change. And I think one of the most interesting things about this study that they highlighted is that the 3 highlighted cows here had the greatest pH shifts, or this total change here, over the course of 3 days. And that at the same time, these animals were also those animal units that had the greatest reduction of milk fat as well. So in addition, what they found is that it wasn't just the total change that they had to consider. They also looked at single pH measurements. But the single pH measurements didn't account for all those differences. So what I'm trying to say here is that variation throughout the day in an animal is what matters. So kind of going on that same thread with the incidence of milk fat depression, another study aimed at assessing the shifts in milk fatty acids due to rumen pH changes. If you look at this particular example, you could see here beta 0 is going to be the variation, and beta 1 is going to be ultimately the average mean pH. And this shows the rumen pH of two different situations where time spent below 5.8 was technically the same, but with differing number of bouts of low rumen pH. And so we can raise the question of how does this high variation in low pH impact an end product like milk fat? So they ended up collecting milk samples and analyzing them for a variety of milk fatty acids. And in this particular study, they utilized a high concentrate ration to induce these low pH conditions. And what they ended up finding is that several milk fatty acids were influenced by either the level of rumen pH or the variation or both. And what I think is quite interesting is whenever we look at some of the isomers that would be kind of considered to be proxies for milk fat depression, namely C18-1 trans 10 and trans 10 cis 12 C18-2. So those milk fatty acids were primarily impacted by variation of the pH and the level of rumen pH. And so on the flip side, whenever we look at some of the normal biohydrogenation pathway fatty acids, they saw that variation did not impact them as much. And so it seems like variation and low pH really kind of shift the biohydrogenation pathway and the rumen to the alternate pathway to produce some of these deleterious rumen isomers for milk fat. So moving on here, there's certainly a question whenever we talk about our lactating animals. Is that really the only thing or animal group that we need to consider? And I think many of us probably agree that dry animals are also important. We need to consider the rumen environment of other cohorts of animals outside of just our lactating cohorts. And so we had pH boluses that were installed in a 2,300 cow dairy. For those of you that are interested, the nutritionist was so kind to provide me with the nutrient profile of the diets that were fed to these animals. So these boluses were installed at dry off and then followed throughout not only the far off, but the close up and the fresh period. And so what you could see here is how these rations had varied in terms of protein, starch, and sugar. And I will also note too that the close-up ration was an acidified ration as well. So in following these animals out, we looked at how prepartum pH impacted performance and if there is any correlation there as well too. And so what you can see here from this visual, we've got in each of the green bars, that's going to be their average pH in each one of those different groups, being far off, close up, and early lactation. So whenever we look at the overall change or the variation throughout the day, that is signified by this green line here. And so the average pH isn't a huge shift whenever we look at considering these three separate groups. But whenever we look at the overall amplitude or the change throughout the day, it was interesting to find that in the close-up phase, we had the most fluctuation. And so I think that is a really important point to highlight, that these animals may be experiencing some compromised rumen conditions that may predispose them to perhaps poorer performance later on. And so that's really what we went after investigating. And so kind of shifting gears a little bit and looking at it in a different way, if we have hours below pH of 6, the far off group is around 3.5 hours below that particular threshold, whereas the close-up and into early lactation was around 7 to almost 8 hours spent below pH of 6. And so considering the fact that we certainly have a condition where minutes below pH of 6 and we have really high variation in amplitudes, that would be something that would be a concern. So what we ended up doing is looking at two particular groups in this study here. And what you'll notice is there is a green line here, and this is signifying rumination. Each shaded bar represents a day, and then the mustard line is rumen pH, okay? So just to orient everybody here. And so what we took was there was a group that was in the close-up phase early in July that had markedly different signatures compared to the latter half of July with group 2. And so we wanted to be able to compare these two different cohorts and see how they differed in their production as well. And so what we identified was not only differences in pH, but also amplitude, minutes below, different thresholds, and rumination. And so I've got the close-up phase here split out with all of these pH parameters with group 1 and group 2. And so what you'll notice here is that the overall mean pH was slightly lower in that initial group. Remember the ones that were in that close-up at the first part of July. Versus group 2, these animals that were later in that month. And the interesting thing here is that both of these groups did show pretty high amplitudes for what we would consider being acceptable for those particular groups in the close-up. However, the biggest thing to note is that not only did this group 1 have a little bit lower pH as a whole, but they also spent a lot of time below pH 5.8 and below pH of 6. And so this is incredibly important whenever we're looking at the ability of those animals to, I'd mentioned the rumen is resilient, and it certainly is, but if these animals are spending a lot of time at these particular thresholds and hanging out down there, there's certainly implications for her having a little bit of a harder time transitioning as well, too. Rumination was actually slightly higher in group 1 versus group 2, but whenever we end up going and looking at what happened after these animals calved into the fresh phase, what we saw was an additional low pH condition that persisted for the group 1, as well as high amplitudes. And so usually within these groups in the fresh phase, we expect anywhere from 0.8 to 0.1, or 1.0, excuse me. And as they get to those higher thresholds, a lot of times we see that higher variation and the possibility of these animals to actually go off feed as well. So it's important to also note that we saw a similar story with our thresholds of minutes below 5.8 and 6. And so not only are we considering that lower pH, but also higher amplitudes and more time spent below 5.8. So you'll see here in the fresh phase, rumination did not differ. And ultimately, the amount of milk in these animals, and they were all similar parities across the board, there was an 11.2 pound milk difference in this particular subset of animals. And so some of you may be curious in terms of what it looked like after these animals calved in terms of their overall pH graphs. And you can see here, we've got rumination once again in that green bar, and then our rumen pH in the yellow or the mustard. And so, of course, you could see a lot of dysregulation, a lot of fluctuation, and certainly in the course of these 3 days, we also see a good amount of time that these animals spend below pH of 6. And so that can be certainly concerning whenever we're looking at overall production, the capacity to keep these animals eating. We don't want these low pH events to negatively impact them. Now, on the flip side, whenever we look at that secondary group, that group 2, that had more favorable pH conditions prepartum, they also carried on postpartum to have a little bit higher shift in rumen pH that persisted and had a little bit less variation. And so you can see whenever we overlay these two particular graphs that there's two separate stories here for these animals. And so that group 1, it's not so surprising to see that milk was much lower because they were constantly ebbing and flowing and never getting into a consistent pattern at all. And so ultimately we could tell that, prepartum rumen health is really an important consideration whenever we look at postpartum performance, and I think that's something that we're going to need to continue to evaluate whenever we're considering how we impact the production of these animals in the lactation phase. So in addition, another thing that we wanted to kind of investigate is what does rumen health look like whenever we have animals that have any sort of metabolic disorder at calving. And so what we ended up doing is we split out the animals that had healthy calvings with no particular problems, just took off. And then we also compared them to their cohorts that had some sort of metabolic event, whether it's ketosis, metritis, milk fever, and just had a little bit of a rougher start. And so we were quite curious to see what that looked like in terms of their overall production, their rumen pH profiles, and so forth. And so what we ended up seeing, and I don't think that this is really any surprise, but I think it's important to note, in the green bars we have our healthy animals, and our orange bars we have our animals that had not really the greatest start in some sort of metabolic disorder. And so what you could see is in the close-up with rumination, we had lower rumination minutes in both the close-up and the fresh. And so this is also something that we see with other herds with our data, as well as in the literature that's pretty consistent. So like I said, this is not necessarily too much of a surprise, but whenever we go and we look at some of the other parameters with these animals, oftentimes what we find is that they have very interesting signatures with rumen pH, and oftentimes a lot of fluctuation as well. And so similar type of story here with the green bars being healthy and the orange being our metabolic animals. And so what you can see is that in the close-up phase we had that high amplitude and that high variation and fluctuation, as well as this carried on into the fresh phase as well too. So there's certainly a lot of explanations that we can kind of go into. Perhaps these animals have impaired compensatory mechanisms to kind of maintain more of a stable scenario and a stable rumen pH, and then that would be a concern whenever we're evaluating postpartum performance. And lastly, I'd also like to note that whenever we look at their overall mean pHs, once again, this is one of the reasons why I like to say that we can't necessarily silo these pH parameters and we have to look at the whole picture. What we saw is that average pH really was pretty similar amongst these groups. And so if you were looking just at one piece of this puzzle in one part of the story, you wouldn't get the whole picture and the dynamic of the situation. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up here, I know probably everybody's excited to grab another cup of coffee or get a donut or something. So just wanted to just kind of bring some of the pieces of this talk today home. So like I mentioned before, we have to be careful of how we're siloing some of these pH parameters whenever we're looking at overall rumen health. We have the ability to not only look at mean pHs across the day or week, but also just the variation with respects to different groups, different days in milk, different rations, a lot of different ways that we can identify where there may be some inefficiency. And so the visibility into the rumen and having like every 10-minute type of time points really gives you a better picture in terms of what's truly happening throughout the course of the day versus having, let's say, maybe a rumen collection at 4 to 6 hours after feeding when you may not collect the whole story. Additionally, we've identified that, of course, transition cow health matters. I don't think anybody will argue that, of course, and it appears that we see kind of a consistent pattern with rumen health and dynamics being altered whenever we have poor transition health. I do think that there's a lot of really good work going on right now with whole systems biology and connecting not only the rumen, but the lower gut, and looking at just the cow as a whole and how there's all this crosstalk amongst these systems. And so I think that we'll just continue to have more work on that. I really recommend having some conversations about that and how we can connect those puzzle pieces together. And then, of course, we know that rumen pH is going to be a quite important part of this puzzle in identifying, overall cow health and how we impact it, how we can really dial in any sort of ration changes, management, and improving how we feed these animals for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So with that, I'd like to wrap it up. I greatly appreciate everybody that stuck with me this whole time. My contact info is on the slide, so feel free to take a picture if you want to holler at me later. Otherwise, please stop by our booth, and I'd be happy to take any questions. There is a roaming microphone, so. Nothing yet? Anybody? Okay, I must have done really good then. All right. Thank you. Appreciate it, everyone.